I think from a psychological perspective, talking about terms of meaning, it's meaning in life that helps you overcome like the suffering in life, and that's something that Viktor Frankl talks about. That's something that Jordan Peterson talks about, and I think ultimately that those are things that you see in the Book of Mormon, right? The narratives of people like Nephi and Moroni um, and even people like Alma. Like Alma's a great example, because he's an outcast and he migrated, and it was the meaning of the gospel that was infused into his life that that helped him overcome all those things.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like what's missing when we talk about the gospel in the 21st century. I
Mm-hmm.
think so. I've heard you talk on Quakey's podcast and other spaces about people's lack of faith, and I like kind of what you're saying, right? You have to kind of go back to the fundamentals, right? Like, does God exist in the first place? And I think that's a good place to start. But I think where most apologists don't finish is at the end of the day, why is this whole thing meaningful? Is it meaningful? Can it make our life meaningful? And if
Mm-hmm.
it can, then we can overcome suffering, and
So,
we can confront the challenges in life.
so I'm curious how what you would say about this is because people talk about meaning and is it meaningful? What do you mean when you talk about is something meaningful? I have my own sort of thoughts on what that term means, as it were. But what does it mean for something to be meaningful versus not meaningful? Because if I want to find out is my life meaningful, it's like what am I even asking?
Right, that's a great question. And it has a few answers. So I'll start simple and then get more complicated. So one way people talk about meaning in life is they think about it. I'm going to use a metaphor. It's kind of like a sentence, right? You have bits of like words. You can string them in a certain way, and if you do it in the right way, the sentence has meaning,
Yeah.
right? If they're out of order, it's incoherent, right? Now, the way that we make meaning in our lives is there's a type of grammar, but it's not like vocabulary. It's more like drama. It's a narrative. Our life has a narrative, and so that's why political parties they love to draw narratives, because they
Mm-hmm.
make sense of the facts, and the role that you're playing in that narrative has meaning. Like, it makes sense how you fit into the story. So
Mm-hmm.
that's one way we make meaning. The other way is like how things are interconnected, right? So, for example, one of my favorite places in Provo is Valor, the music
Mm-hmm.
gallery. I love Valor because the Killers played there, Imagine Dragons played there, Neon Trees played there, Joshua James, all these great artists that are now signed stage acts, national stage artists. They've all played there, and so that place has this interconnectedness, and that has meaning. So it's like a good example that Jordan Peterson uses is if a child knocks over a vase, the mom is upset, right? And you
Mm-hmm.
can say, well, why is she upset? It's just a bunch of glass made out of silicon and glass and whatever. But because it has some type of value associated with it, and we're interconnected, it has meaning. Okay.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying in the relationships between different things
Right.
is
Things
where
have meaning.
meaning things become meaningful, right? A sentence
Yeah.
that's just jumbled doesn't have
Hmm.
any meaning, but a sentence that is ordered in a particular way then becomes meaningful. Is that sort
Right.
of so? Let me build off that idea because I have it's a similar paradigm, but it's a little
Okay.
different.
Sure.
And mine, at least, and I could be wrong on this, is my kind of, as I've thought about that question, what do I mean when I'm talking about meaning? Is meaning is something's relationship to an end or goal, right? So if it's the old Cheshire Cat and Alice in Wonderland, right? If she comes to the fork in the road, the Cheshire Cat appears. He says, well, and she goes, well, which way should I go? Well, he depends. Well, that depends where you want to end up. In other words, it doesn't matter what direction you go. Something gains meaning in relationship to the end that it's trying to achieve, even in a sentence. A sentence has a purpose. It is trying to communicate something. And if the words are not ordered properly, the relationship isn't there to achieve the ended purpose. It's just meaningless gibberish, as we would say. So as
Right.
I view that sort of concept of meaning, I look at it as, because this is what people want to know. Do you have a purpose? It's sort of the idea of teleology. Is there
Right.
telos in the universe? Like, are we traveling towards something, or do my actions, I go left, I go right, I'm going to die eventually, we're all going to die eventually, the sun's going to burn out, this is all memory of this is going to be wiped away. It's as if it never happened in the first place. And that leads you to where, well, then if everything has the same end result in the cosmic scheme of things, then what you do doesn't matter, because it's not connected to any bigger end, any future state, right?
Okay. Yeah. No, I'm glad you brought that up. So, the ancient Greeks, right? The way that they used to think about time is they used to think about it in cycles, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even in Plato's philosophy, right? Like if you're evil, you just reincarnate and you start over.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're in this cycle, it's endless. And even in places like Buddhism and Hinduism, right? Like your goal is to reach nirvana, right? Cessation.
Mm-hmm.
Because that ends the cycle. Now,
Yeah.
what the ancient Hebrews did is they said, no. Time isn't cyclical. It's an arc. There's a narrative arc. And you're
Mm-hmm.
part of the process. Like you participate in God's creation, and it has a telos, right? Aristotle kind of talked about this, but in different terms. But the ancient Israelites, they said, no. Your narrative, your storyline, like every story has a point to it,
Yeah.
right? It's the purpose of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so for them, they thought of time as as a narrative, and there's turning points in that narrative, and in Greek those are called kairos. And so like the way that we look at our lives, right? Like this is why I love Jordan Peterson, because he really picked up on this. We each are like living out a story, probably
Mm-hmm.
an archetypal story, right? Like
Yeah.
like a hero's journey or something like that. And what I see happening is, I was reading, what was it, Jana Reese's book, The Next Mormons, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was a story she had in there in which a woman, she was in her late 20s, maybe early 30s. She hadn't gotten married and hadn't had kids yet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so she left the church because she felt that her life story didn't align with like the church's kind of story for them, right? Get
Mm-hmm.
married at 21 and have kids, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
We have like this romanticized story. And so because her story didn't match, kind of what our culture sort of informs us of what the story was, it clashed, it was incoherent. And then she felt that the church, excuse me, she felt that the church was no longer giving her that sense of meaning anymore. Now, this is
Well,
why.
that is
Oh, go ahead.
very much what the church, if anything, that's the church's biggest thing that it does. It tells you, what's the big thing the missionaries talk about? Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? That's basically saying, what's the story here, guys?
Right,
What's the
exactly.
narrative? And that's what it's meant to grant you, so that you can orient yourself in the universe.
Right. And here's the thing too, is stories have a moral point. They have an ethic, And here's the thing about people, right? Atheists, let's say, scientific mindedly people. It's like, what's the point of the truth? Well, it has a purpose. The purpose of it is to solve some type of problem, right? Otherwise, if the truth didn't solve problems, we wouldn't value it, right? If it didn't alleviate some type of suffering, it wouldn't be worth pursuing, right? And so even when people do science, right? When it comes to things like hypothesis generation and determining what do we study next, what do we research next, our cultural stories and values inform us of that.
Yeah.
And so like science is almost kind of like resting on top of the story. It's trying to figure out.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
it is a tool, but a tool to what end? If a tool doesn't have an end, then it becomes a meaningless thing. And now people will say, to alleviate suffering. And what's funny is, in my understanding of philosophy and studying some of these issues, is that the ultimate end of every action is always the same thing. This is a little bit of one of the biggest sort of revelations that I had, was the realization that every single thing that I do ultimately has the same purpose: to get myself as far from suffering as I can. Now, here's where some people are like, well, wait a minute. Sometimes you do things that cause suffering, and you'll be willing to suffer. You're right. But it's always that, we call that sacrifice. But a sacrifice is only a sacrifice if it pays off in greater well-being down the road, right? If I get farther from suffering by going, it's kind of like the vaccine example. Am I willing to go through some suffering now to have less suffering in the future? And that's what life is. But my point here is that, at least within the church's narrative, what are we ultimately striving for? Exaltation. What is exaltation? But the farthest possible point you can get to away from suffering. But you have to pass through suffering and make sacrifices in order to get to the highest level of being and truly escape suffering. And that's a powerful narrative, man. I mean,
yeah. No, I agree with you. And I think it's hard to sift through some of this, because if you look at the example of Jesus Christ again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jesus Christ, he did the atonement. He died on the cross, right? He went to hell and then he was resurrected. There's no guarantee, as far as I can tell, then, that if you're a good person, you're not going to suffer, right? Like, you will probably suffer maximally if you're a good person.
Mm-hmm.
I think is probably what that story is telling us. But again, to address sort of like the discouragement, like people are saying, right, let's kill unborn children because that will bring us greater alleviation of suffering, right?
Yeah, I don't have to. But to some extent, they're right. Okay,
to a certain extent,
because, and this is what I mean by this. Okay, if I only have 80 years on Earth, this is why this whole ends thing matters so much to me, because I'm not living for 80 years. I mean, it's a big difference when you say you're going to live forever, or you're going to live for 80 years and then you're going to die. And you might be like 60 years old. It's like, you got maybe 20 left. Like, are you going to spend that on things that don't maximize your happiness within that 20-year period? Right? But we don't live that way. People actually live as though they're going to live forever, as if what they do actually matters in some bigger picture. And they'll try and say things like, well, future generations, can benefit from what I'm doing today. And it's like, hey, you know what? Who cares? The sun's going to burn out eventually. Like, it doesn't really matter. It maybe matters a little bit to the next person down the line, but they're going to be gone too. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and hit the subscribe button. Also, if you want more content, including the podcast, go to thoughtful-faith.com. Thanks for watching.